Dr. A.J. Levine, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today a little bit about this much maligned group, the Pharisees.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I actually do like to talk about the Pharisees because there are, my gosh, so many misconceptions that need to be corrected.
And I'm very happy to have you here because I think, speaking from personal experience, growing up, I was one of those people that had a very specific view of the Pharisees, I think from the upbringing that I had and the way that I was led to engage with the text, specifically the New Testament, because they get a specific reputation based on those New Testament texts as being very legalistic, sometimes being depicted as hypocritical. If we step aside from the New Testament for a second to maybe jump back a little bit outside of that, historically, what can we say about who the Pharisees were outside of that depiction?
Right. Fabulous question. So in order to do the history, we need to look at what the various sources of antiquity say. The only Pharisee, self-described Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus. And Paul does not cease being a Pharisee after he has his, road to Damascus experience. In Philippians, he says, as to the law of Pharisee, he's actually trumpeting his credentials. Like, this is a good thing. The book of Acts depicts him following his acceptance of Jesus as Lord, still as a Pharisee, still as worshiping in the temple, still as self-identifying not only as a Jew, but as a Jew of a particular suasion. Mm-hmm. And that, so, I don't think Paul had a morbid conception of God. So I see no reason to think that Pharisees would have a morbid conception of God. I don't see Paul as legalistic, so I see no reason to take this broad thing as legalistic. Mm-hmm. And just for one other example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are a fabulous source for reconstructing life at the time, they never mention Pharisees per se, but they talk about this group called seekers after smooth things, like people who make things too easy. People who say, well, this might be a difficult commandment or this might be a difficult commandment. So we'll make concessions, right? Because we're simply human beings. So the Pharisees are, at least according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, people who make things too easy. And we know these seekers after smooth things are Pharisees because the things that they're concerned about, when we go to rabbinic literature, like the Mishnah, when the Mishnah talks about the Pharisees, same things, same concerns. So when we look at Paul, then the Gospels, then Acts, then the Dead Sea Scrolls. Oh, and then there's Josephus, who talks about the Pharisees as being out among the people and liking the simple life. And for Josephus, the Pharisees are, to use the British term, upjumped. Josephus is a priest. He's elite. And he's upset. In fact, he's just pissed that people at the time are listening to the Pharisees because they don't have any hoity-toity connections. They're just lay people. They're not priests. They're not the elite. But people are listening to them because not only are they talking the talk, they're also walking the walk. We put all this together and we find out that what the Gospels are doing is they're engaging in polemic. They are given their competitors, another way of being Jewish at the time, as negative a reputation as can possibly be. So what we have to do is look at all these other sources, try to figure out who the Pharisees were, recognizing that some Pharisees joined the Jesus movement, and that generally in polemic, the closer you are, the more likely you are to negatively categorize. Mm-hmm. Sort of like Methodists and Baptists, they got to fight. Eastern Orthodox and Baptists, not so much of a big deal. So how do we recover who the Pharisees were, and more, how do we avoid some of this negative Pharisaic teaching that you had when you were a kid that shows up in sermons, that shows up in Bible studies? Because anti-Pharisaic messages transfer very easily into anti-Semitic messages. So not only is doing the history important for the sake of history or to locate Jesus and Paul within their own context, it's important for today when anti-Semitism is on the uptick.
Given that, as you mentioned, Paul is, a rare voice here, speaking as someone who associates with this community, how can we step back in time or outside of those sources within the New Testament that so often dominate the conversation, because I think some people might be surprised to learn that someone like Josephus or the Dead Sea Scrolls have a description, and a description that is so different than the one that maybe they are most used to hearing. So given the dominance of that, how can we go about engaging in that reconsideration?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. In my classes, one of the first things I tell my students is always ask, how do you know that? And if they're reading a secondary source, they're reading an encyclopedia article or a book or an article, just a published article. Well, how does the author know that? What is your evidence? And to recognize that the sources we have, they're all tendentious because they're all speaking from their own particular viewpoint. So if you have half a dozen different sources and 5 of them say one thing and one says something else, what's going on here? It's not that the 5 are right and the one is wrong, but at least recognize that we have different perspectives on the same thing. Mm-hmm. When it comes to New Testament polemic, and boy, I mean, the New Testament does polemicize. So do the shared scriptures. Amos takes no prisoners when he's called out. Right? To try to understand how polemic functions, to try to see how Pharisees change as we go from source to source. So that for example, in Mark, which I think is the first gospel written, and most people would agree with me here, there's nothing new in that idea. In Mark, we have a nice conversation between Jesus and a scribe about what's the greatest commandment. This is part of the end of Jesus' temple teaching. And Jesus comes up with love of God and love of neighbor. Fabulous, says the scribe. Yep, better than all those burnt offerings. Jesus says, you're not far from the kingdom of heaven. Terrific, everybody's happy. When Matthew replays that scene, and again, most biblical scholars think that Matthew was dependent upon Mark, the scribe goes missing. Now we have somebody sent from the Pharisees. There's no affirmation of Jesus' teaching. There's no affirmation by Jesus of the person who asked the question. So what Matthew has done is dropped a Pharisee in where the Pharisee was not originally, in order to provide yet another negative categorization of the Pharisees. So we can see, what are the gospel writers doing with this? When we get to the Gospel of John, we have a Pharisee. His name is Nicodemus, and he's just lovely. When we get to the book of Acts, we have a Pharisee. His name is Gamaliel, identified in Acts as one of Paul's teachers. And it's Gamaliel who speaks up on behalf of Peter and John when the high priest wants to arrest them. And says, I'm not part of this messianic movement, but leave these people alone, because it may turn out that they're right.
Right.
So why do we focus on all the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites? That's Matthew chapter 23. When we could be looking at all of these other sources. Why do we feel the necessity, and I think this is cross-cultural, it's cross-religious, to demonize people who don't agree with us, or who might be our rivals, or who might be our opponents? I don't know if you had this, but I've met a number of students who, when they were growing up, sang songs in vacation Bible school or Sunday school. And there's one popular song, it's still being sung. I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see. I don't want to be a Sadducee because they're all sad, you see. I just want to be a sheep. Ba, ba, ba. And I actually think that little Christian children should have higher career goals than I just want to be a sheep. And one of those career goals might be, I want to be an historian. Because I want to know the backgrounds of these texts. I want to know what Jesus and the Pharisees are debating over. I want to know where Jesus shares things with the Pharisees, such as interpreting Torah rather than taking it entirely literally, adding to the text, where they disagree, for example, on divorce. And on divorce, I'm going with the Pharisees because I don't like the idea of you can't get divorced ever. That's too difficult, and the Pharisees come up with concessions. So how do we avoid anti-Jewish teaching and preaching? How do we locate Jesus and Paul better within their own Jewish context? How do we read the text through multiple lenses? And how do we avoid demonizing our opponents? To ask about Jesus and the Pharisees is to address all of those topics.
Within these, I guess, inside just the New Testament itself, as you've laid out, there are differing views on engagements with the Pharisees or individuals like Paul who self-profess. How do some individuals, I guess, like Paul, escape the demonization aspect where that side, which is so important for him to proclaim, becomes a thing that isn't waged against him in those polemics, but leveraged very heavily against other individuals.
Sure. And that's standard Christian interpretation. So in general Christian interpretation, as soon as somebody in the New Testament accepts Jesus, suddenly they're called Christians, a term Paul doesn't even know and never uses, right? And once they're called Christians in the cultural imagination, they're no longer Jews, as if the parting of the ways began on Easter Sunday. It's sloppy reading, but it's part of our cultural heritage. And it's also true for the synagogue. So if I go into Jewish context and I mention like Paul, my Jewish friends go, oh, because he's a Christian. I say, no, he's a Jew. And they're going, well, how can that be? So we're the product of 2,000 years worth of cultural distinctions. And what we can do as historians and say, well, in the first century, you could accept Jesus as Lord and Savior, and you could still be a Torah observant, practicing, proud Jew. You just happen to be a Jew who believes that the Messiah has come and that the Messianic age has begun. And both Christians and Jews today go, whoa, never thought about it that way. And that's the opening of a very good conversation.
And a very necessary conversation, I think, because as you said, like that song, I never heard that one, but I think some of those names, the sad you see, these memory tools that we use that just remove complexity in order to help someone, a name, and here's one or two teachings you need to know about them so you can have them in your pocket, but don't spend too much time. We want you to spend time over here. But as you referenced, in the teaching of divorce, if we use that as an example you used, where the New Testament wants to present Pharisees as legalistic, but also presents Jesus as, upping sometimes the rules. The ratchet gets tighter in Jesus's teaching. So does that polemic to say they are the legalistic ones, is it an attempt of like self-preservation to make themselves feel a little softer than that other community that we, maybe we're too close and so we don't want you to go over there, come over here, they're really that, we're not?
Yeah, it certainly could be, but heaven forbid that I would suggest that Christians who were interpreting in that manner are doing so for defensive reasons. I don't know their motives, right? But I do know how people have been taught over the centuries, and I suspect that this is something that people have simply been taught, and they really haven't thought about the implications. Because I don't want to ascribe like anti-Semitism or negative motives to people, unless I know them really well, and if they are anti-Semitic, then I will call them out. So yeah, part of it is that Jesus actually makes the law more tighter, as you suggest. I find the term legalism just really problematic. That's a label that's typically given to somebody you don't like. When it comes to Torah interpretation, and this is even in Matthew with all its woe to you scribes and Pharisees stuff, Jesus says, you have heard it said, and then most Christian translations go, but I say to you, that would make the interpretation an antithesis, which is the typical term for you have heard it said, but I say to you. So Sermon on the Mount. It's not an antithesis. So Jesus says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder. The Greek is de, really means and I say to you, do not be angry with a brother or sister. An antithesis would be, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, lock and load and take out as many as you can. That's an antithesis. What Jesus is doing is not making an opposite, he's making an extension. Right? You have heard it said, do not murder. I say to you, do not be angry. This is what Rabbinic Judaism, which is in part the heirs to the Pharisees. The rabbis aren't Pharisees, but they share a number of common concerns, common interests, and common ways of interpreting Torah, is what the rabbis call building a fence about the Torah. You have a law, you make another law to make sure you don't violate the first one. So Jesus says, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. The antithesis would be, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, get a room. All right, that's an antithesis. Jesus says, don't even think about it. That's, again, building a fence about the law, because if you don't think about it, if you don't plan it, and if you don't plan it, you're less likely to do it. So if we want to talk about somebody as being legalistic, it's Jesus doubling down on the commandments rather than loosening them up.
In this framework for your talk, like looking at Jesus and the Pharisees and some of these stereotypes that I think for some people maybe have gone completely unrecognized. in the way that they hold on to these old ideas or these old caricatures. What are some of the most important costs of holding on to this, that are the dangers that come with this, or the damages that it can do to your reading of a text or to your engagement with other individuals, that failing to try to identify and correct some of these stereotypes does?
Yeah. Well, besides yanking Jesus and Paul out of their own historical context, which I think, theologically speaking, is a betrayal of the incarnation. I mean, theologically speaking, the Christian claim is that God becomes incarnate in a particular time and in a particular place. So that if one wants more fully to understand this incarnated deity, it behooves that individual to understand as best as possible what the historical circumstances are. Right? If you say you love someone, you want to know, where were you raised? What's your background? What are your values? And to make Jesus a 21st century individual is a betrayal theologically of the import of the incarnation. In terms of justice issues, negatively to categorize all Pharisees typically results in negative categorization of all Jews. The technical term for this is anti-Semitism. And it is, to go back to your earlier question, a betrayal of the ethical concerns in the New Testament. If the church winds up confessing the sins of the Pharisees, they stop confessing their own sins. So you wind up with this negative image, and then you get the thank God I'm not like the Pharisees. But then if we figure out, well, who are the Pharisees? I mean, they're people who take Torah seriously. They're people who teach among other people. They like the simple life. 3 times in Luke, they invite Jesus to dinner. I mean, that's pretty good.
It's a pretty good group to be around.
Pretty good group to be around, and they're willing to engage. Some of them do join the Jesus movement. Others do not. But when we get to somebody like Gamaliel or even Nicodemus, because I don't think Nicodemus joins, I think he's like a benevolent outsider, they can be your allies. And finding allies is always a good thing if you're doing the work for justice. So if we can avoid maligning these people and then demonizing them, we can better do theology from a Christian perspective. We can better do ethics. And we can better do the work of justice. That's all to the good. But it means figuring out who the Pharisees were. And then once we've got a better sense of who they are, then to go back and reread some of those more problematic passages.
Dr. Levine, thank you so much for taking the time. I think this is a wonderful setup for all of you that are interested in trying to do a little bit to better figure out who the Pharisees are and their relationship with Jesus. I would highly recommend coming to join Dr. Levine at the end of September at the New Insights into the New Testament conference. There's a link down in the description. There's a lot of wonderful things that are going to be happening there. I think your talk is a wonderful topic, a wonderful addition to this area that so often gets, I think, simply passed over because of the way it's ingrained and also some of the difficulty of talking about this kind of topic. So thank you so much for coming today to give us a little bit of an insight, a little bit of a teaser of what you're going to be getting into.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan. Until next time.